morning. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for waking up early and getting over your hangovers, perhaps. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be here. I actually missed 2 planes, or one was canceled and one was delayed, and I almost didn't make it, so I'm extra excited because of this. Thank you for coming. Before I begin, 2 things. First, some acknowledgements. All the work that I will be presenting here has obviously not been done just by me. It has been done by my students primarily, who are the smart people that are actually doing all this cool stuff, and by my collaborators who have influenced the way I think and so on and have helped me with all of this. So this talk would not have been possible without them. A big thank you to them. Second, Heather was right. Thank you for the introduction. I do come here as an outsider. I spend my time at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. This is what our campus looks like. I spend my time teaching and mentoring and doing research with graduate students when I'm not chasing funding like everyone else. But that means that, if you're noticing here, we have not 1 but 2 ivory towers for all the academics at CMU to spend their time in. This means that I'm a little bit an outsider, both to the Scala community as well as to the work that many of you are actually doing on the grounds, building cool things. But at the same time, I did spend quite a bit of time studying how people build open source software and how these communities work and function. So I would really like to share some of these insights with you today. Hopefully it will serve as an interesting point of comparison to the Scala community. But really, I'm here to learn from all of you about how the Scala community operates and works, and what are the challenges that the Scala community faces. Okay. Before we really dive in, can I ask you to also introduce yourselves a little bit? So I'm going to do this with a quiz, and let's see how well the internet works here. So if you would indulge me and take your mobile phones out. I'm assuming you're connected to Wi-Fi somehow. Could you tell me a little bit about sort of what your engagement with open source is, just for me to get a better flavor for who the audience is? So yeah, go to this website, menti.com, and type in the code you see there. Wow, cool. I've actually never done this before. I'm quite impressed. Cool. Whoever built this deserves credit. Cool app. Yeah, love it, right? So this means I'm in the right crowd here. It's exactly what I was hoping for. I was hoping for a mix of people that are busy building open source software and people that are busy using open source software, because we're seeing interesting dynamics from both stakeholders. Okay, this is great. So please hold on to your phones and to this webpage, because we'll be using it a couple more times throughout the talk, if you don't mind. Okay, so I want to talk to you today about open source software and how I see it changing in the last few years. Obviously, I don't need to tell you about how important open source software is. Some of you may have read this great report that Nadia Egbal wrote a couple of years ago, so talking about how open source software is the digital infrastructure that our world relies on, in much the same way that roads and bridges are the physical infrastructure that our economy is based on, and how pretty much anyone and everyone uses open source software to some extent. I'm sure you know this. I'm sure you also know that open source software needs this steady supply of efforts for it to be sustainable. It needs people doing things and sort of continuing to do things over time, because all kinds of bad things can happen otherwise. You might remember the left pad incident. Does anybody know about this from the NPM community? Yeah, many of you know about this. 11 lines of code that took half the internet down for a few hours. You might remember the Heartbleed incident that happened in OpenSSL some years ago. At the time, OpenSSL was maintained by a single full-time person. And it's such a critical piece of infrastructure for all of our economy, pretty much. Okay, so I'm going to argue the premise for this talk is that creating sustainable open source communities is hard. It has always been hard. But I'm going to argue it's maybe even harder today than it used to be before because of the ways in which open source software changed in the last few years. Much like the academic stereotype, I will overpromise and underdeliver. So I'm going to raise more problems than I will provide solutions for. So just a heads up. But to compensate a little bit for the inevitable disappointment that you might have, here's a photo of Nanook, exclusive photo of Nanook that I took myself in Pittsburgh when he was younger. Notice how long the tongue is. I don't know how this is physically possible. Okay, so how has open source software changed? Let me tell you some of the ways that I see it as having changed. One is, obviously, GitHub deserves a lot of credit for standardizing the practice and for changing or standardizing the way people work through their UI and the pull request model. They've made it easier for people to contribute and so on. Now we all speak the same language, this GitHub workflow language. And this has resulted in a lot more production. These stats are probably old by now. There's literally over 100 million open source repositories on GitHub. There's millions more on the other competitors. Some of you might remember this big move when Microsoft announced they're buying GitHub. People were migrating en masse to GitLab, so GitLab is now also a big competitor in the space. Okay, so a lot more open source now than we used to have. A big change is also really this high level of transparency. And this is maybe not obvious at first glance, but it's really, I argue, one of the fundamental ways in which open source has changed together with the emergence of GitHub. The fact that now open source programmers have these social media-like personas and profile pages online that aggregate all kinds of information about them, and similarly, open source projects have these profile pages that aggregate all kinds of information about them. And there's been a lot of research showing how this high level of transparency into what people are doing and how projects are being developed and maintained and so on, how this high level of transparency has been changing pretty much everything. Has been changing the way people collaborate, the way they write code, has been changing recruiting and hiring. These profiles have come to act or to replace traditional resumes for many of us. Another change is the fact that, or I think, the fact that these projects are not really developed in isolation, but really this is a very complex, organic ecosystem of interdependencies, interconnections between projects, between people. There's technical dependencies and so on between libraries. There's social dependencies. There are people that are maintaining multiple projects or contributing to multiple projects at the same time. All kinds of relationships being formed between these stakeholders. This is a very organic, very complex socio-technical ecosystem. It's not just code that lives there somewhere, but it's this big socio-technical thing. And you've seen that this can be quite brittle, right? The left pad example, coming back from a minute ago, you could see how very easily small changes somewhere in the ecosystem can perturb pretty much everything else and have a huge impact. Another thing that changed is this increasing level of commercialization and professionalization. Excuse me. It used to be the case that open source software was built, was maintained by these communities of volunteers, and that's pretty much gone these days as far as I can tell. There's a lot of commercial involvement in open source. There's open source projects that are started by companies and made open source. There's all kinds of startups that are operating in this space and so on. A snapshot from the big survey that GitHub ran a couple of years ago, some of you might remember this, shows that a lot of people that are contributing to open source are doing it as part of their jobs. And the small poll we ran a couple of minutes ago showed the same thing again. So interestingly, does anybody know about the Equifax scandal? Fewer of you then left pad. Okay, good. So Equifax is a company in the United States that calculates the credit score of Americans, which affects their ability to get credit from banks and so on. Equifax was hacked a year or two ago, I don't remember exactly, and as part of that, the personal information of about 150 million Americans, so that's half the population of the United States, the personal information of about 150 million people was stolen. And interestingly, Equifax blamed all of this on an open source project, on Apache Struts, which is where the vulnerability happened, even though they never contributed themselves to open source, they never supported open source development, and they actually never reacted to all the warnings and requests to update their out-of-date versions of struts to remove this vulnerability. So a lot of expectation, a lot of pressure from users of open source that the infrastructure be of high quality, be very reliable, be very secure, and so on and so forth. This is just one of many examples of this increasing pressure that's being put on open source maintainers. You also see this in the smaller day-to-day interactions between users and maintainers. Because, again, with GitHub, it's so much easier now to contribute, to report issues, to submit pull requests, anyone can do it. There's obviously growing volumes of these things. There's a lot more of these. This is a snapshot I took yesterday. Oops, there we go. A snapshot I took yesterday of the Scala GitHub page showing close to 2,000 issues being open, I guess pretty much at any point in time. There's thousands of these issues being opened. I don't know if there's any plan of ever closing them or if there's just a backlog. I don't know exactly what the situation is, but lots of these requests that somebody has to look at and decide something about and do something with. There's also social pressure to respond to your contributors as a maintainer, because if you don't, you risk losing them, they risk going away and never coming back, and research has shown this. And all kinds of very interesting, arguably toxic interactions that are visible in these open source communities. I am pasting here 2 quotes. We have been collecting these. There's many examples like these of very rude, very entitled types of requests that users are making on the open source or to the open source maintainers. Okay, so this brings me to my next quiz. I'd like to get a feel for how prevalent these things are in the Scala community. Can you tell me if you ever feel as maintainers or contributors to open source, those among you that are doing this, could you tell me if you ever feel overwhelmed by the amount of feature requests or issues or bug reports and so on that people are, that users are producing on your projects? Interesting. Wow, so this is worse than I thought. About half of you are saying that this is an issue, that there's a lot of demand and arguably a lot of stress being caused by these high volumes of requests. Thank you so much. So similarly, Do you feel that this is sustainable? Are these interactions healthy, do you think? Sorry. I'll come back to the other one in a minute. Do you feel that these are healthy interactions? Is this sustainable? Do you see this continuing without people burning out, without you burning out, without users going away? Right, so this mirrors to a large extent what we saw earlier. There's still a lot we could do to improve, it seems. Related to this, how do you prioritize these things? When you get all these requests from your users, how do you prioritize these, right? I'm assuming that almost 2,000 open issues in Scala right now. Somebody has to prioritize, even looking at these, let alone closing them and dealing with them. Like, how do you do this? I would love to hear how people actually do this, and if there are any best practices that we could learn from as a community, that others could learn from you, in terms of how to deal with this. Random. High risk first. Upvotes, that's a nice way. So upvotes, I guess, means whether you perceive that this issue affects lots of people, whether lots of people care about fixing this, that gets higher priority. Interesting. What does go to sleep mean? Whoever answered that, maybe would help clarify. How do you know what's critical, though? Is that obvious from just the surface level report? Can you always tell? Okay, thank you. I'll come back to this later and share a summary of all of these things with you after the talk. One more thing that I see changing, I don't know to which extent it's changing, but I'm going to argue in a second that it has, but as opposed to it being always the status quo, really low demographic diversity in these open source communities. On the one hand, you have this low barrier to entry, at least in theory, on paper. Anyone can contribute to any open source project. It's all out there on the web somewhere, on GitHub, usually. On the other hand, very, very low demographic diversity. Here in particular, I'm talking about women as one of the underrepresented minorities. There's around 5% women in these open source communities, either GitHub or Stack Overflow, which is really surprising because industry reports about 20% or so women in technical jobs in software engineering. And this is very strange because if you ask open source contributors and maintainers about what the perception is, you get answers like these. We actually asked people, this is from a study we did a few years ago, people perceive that demographic identity is irrelevant and it's all about the code, right? The code sees no color or gender. It's one of the quotes we get from open source maintainers. So how is it that there's just so few minorities in general and women in particular contributing to these? Just as an aside, regardless of what your philosophy or political orientation here is on this issue, there is evidence that teams that are more diverse, in particular software teams that are more diverse, are more productive. We ourselves in our group found some of this evidence a few years ago in a study. We saw that holding other confounds fixed, teams that are more diverse with respect to gender and or tenure or experience, they tend to write code faster than teams that are less diverse. Again, holding other variables constant. There's also this idea that by making anything really more inclusive for one particular minority, you make it better for everyone else. I stole this slide from Anita Sarma and Margaret Burnett. They're two faculty members at Oregon State University in the US. The classical example are these curb cuts. Okay? These little curb cuts have been developed for people in wheelchairs historically, but they've come to serve a very wide range of users, people on bikes, people with strollers, people with walking helpers, people with luggage, and so on and so forth. So really, by making our communities more inclusive to one particular minority, we end up making it better for everyone else. Okay, so what we do, what my group does, what I've been doing over the last few years is looking at data that comes from these open source communities, and we have the luxury of getting access or having access to large quantities of this data. We've been looking at this to try to learn about how these communities have been changing, what effects these changes have had, and trying to understand really if there's anything we could do to reduce or reverse some of these negative effects. And I want to share a few examples of our research with you today, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things we're finding. I'm going to start with an example of transparency. Here we're looking at these repository badges. But before then, I want to ask you one more time, if you will indulge me. Could you please tell me what non-code contributions do you see or do you do yourselves in open source projects? So what is there besides just writing code? What other kinds of contributions do you see or do you value in open source communities besides code? So I'm going to leave this on. Hopefully, oh, great, thank you. Documentation is a big deal. Marketing, publicity, triaging. Oh, support, Getter support, very interesting. Stack Overflow. That's great, thank you so much. Documentation is really a big deal. Triaging too. Okay, the reason I'm asking you this is because of one particular new kind of contribution that we're seeing people do, which is this sort of beautification, if you will, work that's happening around open source projects, adding sparkle, adding glitter to open source projects. I told you already, we talked about how these communities are very transparent, that you get this first-hand view into what everyone and anyone is doing. One particular kind of transparency, and we call these signals. We call all these little visible cues that are present on these pages, like the number of stars and the number of commits and so on, the number of followers people have. We call these signals. One particular kind of signal that we're seeing pop up more and more are these repository badges. And some of you may have seen these on usually embedded in README pages that are displayed on the homepage of an open source repository. Now, it's very interesting because these signals extend by a lot the range of things that open source maintainers can choose to make transparent beyond the few things that are available by default in the GitHub user interface. So we've been studying what effects just signaling, displaying these pieces of information has on how users perceive these, or contributors perceive these open source projects. To give you a flavor, I won't go into details, but feel free to ask me afterwards if you're interested, but just to give you a flavor, we can detect based on the Git history, the version control history of these projects, we can detect when a particular badge has been introduced. For example, here we're looking at a dependency manager badge, and we can detect when that was introduced. And we can plot relative to this introduction time different outcome measures. For example, how up-to-date people's dependencies were relative to when this was introduced. say this is in one particular package, lower on the y-axis is better here, the fresher the dependencies are, the better. And you could see how once they started using a dependency manager and they started signaling this through a dependency manager badge, people kept up with their dependencies much better and they kept updating them. We could do this over many projects and we could overlay these different graphs, which gives us a bunch of these distributions of values, which we can then analyze statistically to reason about trends and changes in these trends relative to the intervention. And this gives us a very robust way of making some almost causal arguments about the value or the effect of these particular interventions. I'll give you two examples. Here we looked at how people's dependencies are becoming fresher, if at all, after people start displaying these dependency manager badges, and you can see a very strong effect here. You can see that not just that these dependencies become immediately fresher, but they also remain fresher over time. This is over a sample of many tens of thousands of packages from NPM. So really, really big sample. Similarly, we looked at the value of these continuous integration build or code coverage badges, and we found something really, really interesting. We found that users, contributors to these open source packages, once these testing-related badges are being displayed, the contributors are much more likely to incorporate, to add unit tests together with their pull request contributions. Okay? They do this just naturally because the maintainers are signaling that they care about code quality and they care about testing. So what I'm showing on the y-axis is for every month, the fraction of pull requests that have been submitted to those projects in that particular month containing test cases. You can see how after they started signaling that they care about testing and code quality, that people started submitting test cases much more, and they kept doing this over time. Really interesting. So what about Scala? I looked at this a little bit yesterday, and all I could find is a Scala CI badge on the README page of Scala. So before you get too excited and start adding all kinds of badges to Scala, a couple of takeaways. First of all, we are seeing that it's not just enough to put any badges there for these effects to happen. It really matters whether the badge is doing anything interesting or not. So in this case, we're seeing that badges that have some kind of underlying analysis, for example, a continuous integration score, code coverage score, what have you, dependency manager score, something that has some kind of analysis in the background, computing the value that is to be displayed, these have much stronger effects than the badges that just display some random information. So this means, for example, if you have a choice between a support badge like this, the one on the green one, the Slack join badge, just links to the channel where people can go and ask questions. The other one, the red one, not just does that, but also shows in real time how many maintainers are active on that particular Slack channel. So this one has a stronger effect in terms of attracting contributors because it's harder to fake. It also requires more effort from the part of the maintainers. So prefer these ones that have some kind of underlying analysis over the ones that just link to things. Also, don't add too many. We're seeing an interesting effect here where if you add too many badges to these projects, then it takes away from the perceived quality and the perceived value. So here I'm showing you the popularity of these packages, the number of downloads that they get as a function of how many different badges they have controlling for other confounds. And you could see that there's a magic number around 5 or so where you get most bang for your buck. What else could you do with these? Well, for example, we're doing some research at the moment looking at what kinds of signals potential contributors are looking for when deciding to contribute to your package. And one thing that comes up both in interviews with contributors as well as in these models over large data sets is that people care about the tone of a particular community. People care about how friendly a particular community appears to be. So perhaps there's some room to automatically compute some of these and display, I don't know, sentiment analysis, politeness scores, what have you, something that tells you something about how welcoming a particular community is. Similarly, we're seeing that just small things like explicitly asking for contributions and explicitly asking for help goes a long way towards enticing people to come and contribute to your projects. So small things that make a big difference. Okay, so this was transparency. Another quick thing, we have been looking at the ecosystem of Python packages that are part of the PyPy package manager. And we're trying to understand what predicts or explains whether some of these packages will become abandoned. So here I want to ask you again, how do you screen libraries when deciding which ones to adopt? How do you screen them to make sure that they'll be maintained in the future? What kinds of things do you look for? I'm going to just flip to this. And while you do this, I'll tell you a little bit about what we found. Two examples. First, we looked at the impact of transitive dependencies. Things that, so direct dependencies have become more visible, more salient. There's infrastructure now on libraries.io, for example, or on GitHub directly to display or direct dependencies, but there's very little that's visible in terms of transitive dependencies. Arguably, the impact of LeftPad when that happened was a lot because of these transitive dependencies, things that depended on things that depended on LeftPad rather than the things that depended on LeftPad directly. So here, one argument could be that if you have some problems upstream, if you need help, if you need effort, then the more transitive dependencies you have, the bigger the pool of potential contributors that could come in and help. Well, what do you think we're finding? We're finding exactly the opposite. We've modeled the chances of packages becoming dormant here, and we're seeing that the more transitive downstream dependencies there are, again, controlling for many other confounding factors, the more transitive dependencies there are, the more likely a package, the upstream package, is to become abandoned. One possible explanation we're learning from the interviews with the Python maintainers is that these downstream users, the far removed ones, are just as likely to complain about issues, but they are much less likely to actually do something about it and help. So interesting how, the farther you are from something, the less you care about it, it seems. Another thing we looked at in the study is the impact of commercial involvement in these open source packages. So here we modeled whether packages have a lot of contributions from people with explicit commercial affiliations as opposed to not, and what impact that has on the chances of the package becoming abandoned, again, controlling for all kinds of confounding factors. What we're seeing is something worrying, again, that these packages with high levels of commercial involvement appear to be less sustainable than the ones with lower levels of commercial involvement against what you might believe otherwise, or at least against what we believe going into the study. And one explanation that the maintainers we talked to gave is that while this high level of commercial involvement comes with more resources and a lot of help in the short term, it's also a lot more unstable. This support can withdraw and can go away anytime. So there's a lot more risk that comes with it. So interesting. So the takeaway here is that whatever happens in any particular project is really not just a function of the local community, but a function of the much broader ecosystem of interconnections and interdependencies between that project and everything else. Right? So we should be looking at the entire ecosystem when we're looking at individual projects or packages. Finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about a study we did very recently looking at how open source contributors remain engaged and more active in these open source communities over time. So here, this is the last question that I would like to ask you. Were there any events or people that encouraged you to seriously get involved and stay involved in open source? So as opposed to deterrents, things that might throw you away, was there anything in particular that really encouraged you to stick around and to become more active? Was there a person that helped you in that sense? What kind of role was this person in? Who were they? Was there an event that helped you? Right, was there a community event like this? Like, what was it that made, if anything, a big transformation on your engagement with open source? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this. Here, we're seeing, coming back to this issue of diversity, we're seeing that women on GitHub disengage earlier than men do. For example, here you can see that, say, after 12 months, about 70% of men are still active, but only about 60% of women. And I apologize for this binary gendered split here. We had to do this because otherwise the analysis would have been intractable computationally. But we're obviously aware that gender is much more nuanced than just binary. We just couldn't compute with more categories than two. So, okay, so a lot of this could be cultural, and there have been many studies arguing this about open source culture. For example, I'm quoting, "Sexist behavior in FLOSS is as constant as it is extreme." This was an ethnography from a few years ago. There's a study that we did a few years ago as well. I quote again from one of our participants, "I have used a fake GitHub handle so that people would assume I was male." Okay. By the way, before you ask, gender is not explicitly recorded on GitHub. We know this, but people do infer this very easily and very often from things like your name and your profile picture. Again, because of this high level of transparency into who you are in open source. So this is a ranking of features that open source contributors we surveyed recognize amongst each other. And gender is the second most visible attribute here after programming skills, very surprisingly and interestingly. Right, so people do really tell this, even if it's not explicitly recorded. Another interesting study from a couple of years ago, pull request acceptance rates are lower when gender is apparent as opposed to not easily observable, meaning people don't have easily identifiable names or profile pictures. For both men and women, pull request acceptance rates are lower. Very interesting. You could also argue that the platform itself, perhaps, at times creates the wrong incentives. Does anybody remember the longest streak feature on GitHub? Okay, a few of you. This was a feature that was displayed on people's profile pages. It showed the number of consecutive days that GitHub has seen you committing to some repositories hosted there. So this person was very proud to have committed for a whole year every single day, without any interruptions. This caused a huge backlash in the community. You might remember people complaining that this really creates the wrong incentives. It motivates people to avoid taking breaks and stepping back, and can be harmful to the well-being of contributors and therefore harmful to open source as a whole. This was the manifesto that started the entire movement against the longest streak feature, which has since been removed from GitHub Pages. It's not part of GitHub Pages anymore. So all kinds of reasons. We looked at some sociological reasons that might explain why people stick around or disengage from these open source communities. And turns out there's a really, really rich and interesting theory, a social capital theory, that people have been using in sociology for a long time. It talks roughly about two kinds of social capital. There's the bonding kind and the bridging kind. The bonding kind is about close ties and about community building, feeling embedded in a particular community, and this causes higher willingness to continue to contribute. The bridging kind is about getting access to new opportunities and new ideas and so on, so bridging across communities, and this provides people new opportunities to continue their engagement. So that's all fine, but again, the theory here says that when you have very unbalanced groups, like we do, for example, in terms of gender in these open source communities, when you have such high imbalance along any dimension, really, there's a risk of echo chambers forming and exclusion happening, where the majority group ends up excluding the minority group, whatever that may be. So here, because of the low representation of women, there's a higher risk for them to be excluded from these male-dominated communities, is what the theory would predict. So at the same time, the theory explains or predicts that if minorities are instead part of teams that are diverse, not demographically, because we know that's not the case, but if they're diverse with respect to other attributes, like the kinds of ideas they have or the kinds of information they have available, if minorities are part of these more informationally diverse groups, then that should provide with higher engagement and longer-term engagement. And here, this should especially benefit people that are minorities, like women. So we did this really interesting study. I can tell you the details offline, but we looked at a sample of about 60,000 open source contributors from different communities, and we compiled a sample in such a way that this was balanced, men and women, half and half. We used an automated gender inference technique here based on people's names, which works reasonably well. I could tell you the details of that, but again, this is why we had to make this assumption of binary gender, and we couldn't do anything more sophisticated. And then we did survival analysis on top of this. We tried to model why people, what factors explain people's disengagement from open source as a whole. And we're seeing across the board exactly what the theory would predict. We're seeing that the more social capital people build, the higher they stay engaged. So this is, again, the same kind of survival curve. It shows the probability of still being engaged in open source in any project, really, over time. And here you're seeing how I'm showing you two curves, one for people with high social capital and the second for people with low social capital. And this holds for many different ways in which we measured social capital. But we're seeing the same effect time and again, that people that build more social capital, they're more successful long-term. At the same time, we're seeing this really interesting interaction effect between gender and these measures of information diversity in these teams. I'm showing you here curves of the difference in survival probability between contributors with high and low programming language diversity. We're using programming language as a proxy for the kinds of information or technologies or ideas that these teams might have access to. And we're saying that if everybody speaks the same programming language in those groups, people are less informationally diverse than if people have a lot of experience with a lot of programming languages from other projects they worked on before. So two things to note here. First of all, as you'd expect, the curves here are always positive. So the more of this information diversity there is, the more people survive. This holds for both men and women. But second, and interestingly, it seems women benefit more from this than men do, again, exactly as the theory would predict. So here, we're seeing that there's no difference in survival probability between men and women in roughly the first year or so, regardless of how much of this information diversity there is. But later on, there's a much higher increase in survival probability for women that are exposed to these informationally diverse teams compared to men. So women benefit more from this information diversity than men do. So, this provides a very clear way for us going forward and trying to increase diversity and retention in these communities by investing in ways that could help people build more social capital and fostering these sort of inter-technological collaborations and so on, where people get access to these different ideas and these different technologies, and they get a chance to learn about new things and continue their engagement long term. So just to wrap up, I argued that it's hard to create sustainable open source communities. It has always been hard, but perhaps it's particularly harder these days because of the ways in which open source software has changed. I've shown you some of these changes. We talked about high transparency. We talked about high levels of demand and stress that are being put on these maintainers. We talked about this really low demographic diversity that's present in open source communities. And I gave you some examples, 3 from our research group, of studies that have tried to understand these problems better and try to propose some solutions to these problems. But really, we are only beginning to scratch the surface of even understanding these problems, let alone solving them. This is something that goes well beyond what any single research group could do. So really, I'm here to beg for your help. We really need your help to understand these problems better and even begin to solve them. So please, talk to me, talk to my colleagues about the sustainability challenges that your particular open source projects are facing, and would love to think about those problems together with you and try to solve them. So with this, I'll end, and thank you very much.
Thank the speaker. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody is so inclined. There's one over here. Yeah, the mic is coming to you.
I have a hard time seeing you because of the lights.
Yeah. Anybody after? Okay, so question number 2 is over here, and then we can...
Hi.
You can come talk afterwards.
Thank you for your talk. I'm seeing that this inclusion of minorities is a big thing here at Scala Days, but also a couple of weeks ago at KubeCon. But I was wondering, how does this exclusion work? Because I'm not really aware that community are excluding people, and I'm not aware of me excluding minorities. So I'm just curious, did you also look into how people are being excluded?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you. That's a good question. One thing, 2 things I could say. One is, historically in these platforms, there's higher emphasis being put on code contributions over other kinds of contributions. This is the reason why I was asking the audience for what other non-code contributions do you see, do you do, and do you value in open source? So this isn't about men versus women or about any particular minority versus any particular majority, but it's about catering to different information processing styles and styles of contributing and so on. Right? So there's a very wide range in any particular demographic group of preferences for these things, but really, I think we should be welcoming more diverse kinds of contributions and valuing them equally. That's one thing. Second is, there's this implicit culture that we're not explicitly discriminating or hardly ever as a community or as individuals, we're hardly ever doing this explicitly, but there's this implicit culture that carried over, I'm not sure exactly from where, but it's the perception is there, and our studies and other people's studies and big GitHub open source studies with thousands of people have shown time and again that there is this perception that some of these communities and some of these maintainers are just not welcoming. Maybe Linus Torvalds is one example of a kind of interaction style that is not welcoming. Again, not about women versus men, but to anyone really, right? There's only probably a few people that like this kind of interaction and engagement and seek it.
We have one more, I think, maybe afterwards, yeah, but one more question over here before we change sessions.
Hi. You've talked about sustainability and diversity. I mean, we haven't really acknowledged the massive hidden subsidy for open source that comes through the fact that it takes skilled people with the time and space to contribute. Apache or GitHub, they don't pay your college fees, they don't pay your childcare, they don't look after your elderly parents, and they don't pay your rent. Could you say a few words about the sort of economic basis and how we can actually improve diversity and so on?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that ties perfectly to the previous question, and I forgot to mention that earlier. Thank you for asking. I think you're right. I think that's absolutely part of the problem. It's only the privileged people, if I can say that can afford to do open source right now, because most other people are just busy having real jobs and whatnot and supporting their families and whatnot, putting themselves through school, so they don't have the time or the energy to do this as a hobby, right? It's the people that already have the means to support themselves and their families that can afford to put in this extra time and hobby and passion into building open source. I think you're absolutely right. I don't know how to fix this, but I think you're right.
Okay, let's thank Bogdan, the prominent female professor from a gender studies department. And thank you again for coming out. It was really cool. So we have the next session starting in like 7 minutes, so run to the next one you want to go to.